Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. Thank you very much for inviting us into your home again this week. And as you can see by us, I am joined this week again by John P. Capitalist. Hi, John.
Hey, how you doing, everybody? Great to be back, Chris.
Yes, thanks for coming back. And you and I have had a few discussions now, and we have talked about Scientology. We have talked about, we did a podcast recently about potential end times for Scientology and maybe not so potential end times, and some of the factors concerned with this. And I have always been fascinated by your research-driven and evidence-based points of view on these topics. And so while, I am into the psychology and sociology of these things, you take a bit of a more hard-nosed, real-world, financial, economic, socioeconomic view of this stuff. And by your training and background and profession, you are qualified to do so. So it's always fun having these discussions with you. So again, thanks for coming back to the show.
Absolutely. And I think, Scientology has been fascinating to me for, 10 or 12 years. But of late, I've been starting to look at other groups and starting to look at, of course, as you suggest, through the lens of economics, what these various groups can do and what can economics and organizational theory teach us about where cults are likely to go in the future. And so, as you recall, we talked about sovereign citizens maybe 3 and change years ago, before the pandemic, which I think is a very important data point. And while as prepping for this, I watched that podcast again the other day, and it's held up pretty well. But I think there's more layers that have been added to the puzzle, so that what we were talking about then is still true, but there's also new stuff that's arisen, and a lot of how it's where it's going has really been influenced by what's happened to people during the pandemic, and I think that's why it's really worth coming back and revisiting the topic.
Absolutely, and yeah, you have been keeping your eye on a couple of different groups around in the Western Hemisphere, I guess you could say, and we're going to get into some of the details of these groups and what they're about. And I wanted to kind of intro this a little bit with. These are groups that I have tended on my channel to go more in the direction of, I don't know how to put it, tent pole cults, like the bigger ones, the kind of ones that have a lot of name recognition or have something about them that they're in the current news cycle or they're somehow being brought up in that way. And these ones are actually a little bit flying, not totally under the radar. Clearly, there is media reporting on these groups. But the ones we're going to talk about today are more of, I think, a reflection, as we'll talk about, that internet model that I have referred to or talked about from time to time. And this is a really new thing in terms of cult studies or the field of how extremist, high control, authoritarian groups, propagate, disseminate, grow, in other words, get their messages out. And we're seeing now with the rise of, the internet now being part of our daily lives and us sort of being in this, what did Elon Musk call a sort of symbiotic relationship with our phones and this kind of thing. I mean, I can't go anywhere without my phone now. If I do, I feel like I'm unattached from the world. And I know I'm far from the only one that way. We have an entire generation or two now of people who are being raised where they have no concept of what it is to live in a world without an internet. And it used to be that the world was not quite as connected as quickly as it is now. And so we see some interesting, I guess I'll say phenomenon, some interesting, results of that in terms of how cult leaders, narcissists, authoritarians, whatever label you want to put on people who really don't have everybody else's best interests in mind, how these people will get messaging out there and how they will attract a following from all over geographical areas because the internet is far-reaching, and grow these little weird groups, and sometimes not so little, and sometimes dangerously not so little. So on that happy note, I guess we will dive into this week. So what do you have for us, John?
Okay, so you're absolutely right about the internet, and I would say more accurately, social media enabling formation of these kinds of groups. So other types of internet, using internet to transact business for an existing cult is, somewhat well understood. Scientology completely misjudged it, but they are doing some internet-based courses now. Yeah, it's a little behind the curve, but they're doing this. And I assume better run organizations like Landmark and so forth have been working on internet-based ways of keeping in touch with their customers. So I don't follow Landmark particularly, but I'm sure that people have older organizations have been really adapting to the internet. Maybe not social media, but there's I think we want to talk about these groups as only existing because of social media. They couldn't have existed with the models that they do unless social media as it exists today was around.
That's right.
So what I want to do is I want to look at three separate groups that have arisen maybe in the last 18 months or so. And I want to look at how they arose, what they believe, how that belief, that dogma or that content has evolved over time, and how the in real life aspects driven by that content have evolved and seem likely to evolve in the future. So the three groups are, first, the Queen of Canada. So there's a woman named Romana Didulo, who's a Philippine immigrant, late 50s, early 60s, who proclaimed herself the Queen of Canada. Apparently, Queen Elizabeth was deposed somehow, and nobody else really seems to be aware of this. And so she's actually built up something of a following. Now, for this discussion, I am going to step out of character a little bit. For those of you who read the comments that I write on Tony Ortega's blog, it's been a running joke for a number of years that I pretend that Canada is merely a quaint rural region of upstate New York located somewhere north of Buffalo. The capital of Toronto is a place, or capital of Canada is a place called Toronto, mostly lumberjacks and fur trappers and all sorts of other bizarre notions. And really that's been more of, it's been intended as a lampoon on ignorant Americans who don't know anything about our largest trading partner. I've actually, this started years ago when I was investing in Canadian companies. I'd go up there and I'd visit the CFOs, and I would be prepared with an understanding of Canadian research and development tax law that subsidizes innovation, et cetera, et cetera. And they were always surprised when I actually had some idea about this stuff, because I heard stories about these are smart, educated Harvard MBA type people who go to Canada and don't really seem aware that Canada is a separate country with its own tax laws and its own incentive structure for companies to do good things. And so, I've seen this astonishing ignorance. So that's all a front. We're going to set that aside. And I actually do know things about Canada, but I reserve the right to slip back into that sort of persona when this conversation's done. So she has been the Queen of Canada. She's issuing royal decrees, and we'll talk about what those decrees are and how her followers are clinging to those and getting themselves in some real trouble, and how they're starting to push back against the government who is legitimately ignoring these royal decrees. And there is, from an unlikely assortment of people, these are relatively benign sorts of housewives and, senior citizens and so forth, who are actually casually threatening violence against anybody that doesn't follow the Queen. The second group we're going to look at, the group itself doesn't really have a name, but the guy in charge is called Negative 48. And this is the one that's been hanging around in Dallas. Last year, they promised that JFK Jr. was going to reappear on November 2nd and was going to restore Trump to power.
And to be clear, this group is a direct offshoot of QAnon.
Yeah. The Queen Romana, the Queen of Canada, is also a relatively minor QAnon influencer until she hit on this current thing in early 21. So she also has the QAnon backstory and source of followers.
Interesting.
The third group is a little bit more classic sovereign citizen, and it's called the Rise of the Moors. And the Moors are a sovereign citizen group that's almost exclusively Black. And we'll talk more about the history of that group. But the rise of the Moors is a particular faction that's really broken in a very different direction than most of the rest of the Moorish sovereign citizen crowd, and has gotten very, very close to significant armed violence. And we'll look at why that might be, and we'll look at how their real flirtation with significant violent action may be a harbinger of things to come from other groups. So I think we're really looking at groups here that are the opposite end of the spectrum from Scientology to Moonies and these other established groups. Right? Scientology has been around for almost 70 years. The Moonies, similarly, transcendental meditation, 50, 60 years. Landmark, 50 years. So all of these groups have been around for a long time, and the hallmark of all of them is that they're run like a business, because they were all formed in a time where you needed personal contact, you needed an office location, recruiting was done personally, and so forth. And as you're suggesting, and I agree completely, social media has inverted all of that, and now you don't need an office, you don't need anything other than a GoFundMe to have the donations that people kick in land in your bank account.
Exactly.
But then again, and so I think that, but then again, this new model has some limitations that the older groups don't have. So,
right. If I might, let me just comment quickly also as well that while the genesis of these groups may be online, what is kind of interesting and concerning, I'm not going to say terrifying, but I am going to say concerning, is that they have become or are moving to in real life model from an online genesis, you could say, or source, right? They start online. QAnon was, coming straight out of 4chan and 8kun, and then starts having real life demonstrations and protests, and then ultimately January 6th, they were part of that. These groups as well, start with this online component, but then move into the real world, and that's certainly with Negative 48 and these. I think all three of these groups were seeing that. Yeah.
So I think we've got social media as a catalyst for this particular type of group, but social media has been in its current form for something on the order of 10 years. Twitter, some of the other instant messaging groups. And Facebook, YouTube, all of this stuff has been relatively well set. But why now? And I think the second piece of this is really a function of the pandemic. And I think you're actually, and I've read articles, and I don't have data on this, but I think we'll be able to see data emerging in the next year or two that allows us to look back and see that this has actually happened. Is that I think the pandemic is really, really going to be hard on certain types of churches that have really depended on a community to bind people very tightly to the organization. And so I think this is going to hurt particularly the more evangelical and not necessarily the mainstreams, which have been struggling for other, so this is not, the pandemic's not going to really hammer the Episcopalians, but it is going to potentially hammer the Baptists and the mega churches and so forth. And what I think people are doing is, that a lot of people really go to church for the community. They're lonely, or they just want to be part of a community. Maybe they're not lonely, but they they value the entertainment value of the religious service as much as they do the moral and spiritual uplifting. But they also value the socials and the activities for the kids and all this other stuff. And when you're cut off from that, as in the pandemic, it's very difficult. And I know a lot of churches have struggled. A lot of pastors have seen real burnout, but the people have started to socialize online, and a lot of them end up going down this rabbit hole of QAnon, and it ends up. I've read articles from various sources that a lot of people, a lot of ministers are like, "What is this QAnon shit?" That people are becoming stridently militant about this, and it's actually taking donations away. People are trying, and it's taking people out of the pews, and they're turning into full-time QAnon adherents when they are stuck at home. And so I think that it's an alternative community. And I think one of the attractions of the community is that there's a sense of mission So QAnon in particular, hey, it's like my life is empty and meaningless, and I'm stuck at home in this stupid pandemic, and my job is falling apart, and I'm not getting the work hours. But now I'm sitting here behind my keyboard, and I am battling satanic, pedophile, baby-eating Democrats. So my life has some meaning, even though all I'm doing is typing comments that agree with other people who talk about how evil those, imaginary baby-eating, adrenochrome harvesting Democrats are.
Yep.
But it gives my life some meaning, and it's just, and so that's really cool.
It also, if I might, it also adds elements of hope, of future, of being able to do something about it, of the feeling of being able to do something about it, of participating with others in something that's going to, in their minds, change those evils of the world and make themselves out to be the good guys.
Yep.
And this is, of course, something that is part and parcel of every cult experience. And so this is no different, but it's also very, very important part of this whole thing is these are, to a great degree, people on a mission.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's, and I think that's interesting because QAnon is starting to splinter, right? The fact that there have been no, Q drops in 2 years.
Well, there are some new ones.
Yeah, but it's not. But it's pretty clear who Q is at this point.
Exactly, and it's very interesting how Q, as the QAnon community, has literally splintered in such a way that when the new Q drops came down, there were people who were immediately nah. We don't even need Q anymore. And believe me, of all the things I thought I would see in that group, that's actually not something I predicted. That was a fascinating thing to happen, and that's where these groups are emerging from.
Well, the thing is that Watkins has been shitposting just this random, bizarre stuff, and he never made an attempt to build any sort of organization, and so it's been wide open for the interpreters and influencers to grab at the ability to make money.
Yeah.
And by the way, I know somebody who now dead, but I've known somebody for many, many years who actually had a Q clearance.
Right.
And
actual Department of Energy confidential level clearance.
Sinwitties, Qs, the whole ladder of everything. Very, very senior aerospace guy who worked on nuclear weapons and had all of the clearances as a senior executive in charge of programs to do this stuff. And he would, in general and appropriately general terms, talk about the fact that the restrictions on what he knew were actually extremely onerous and difficult within just nuclear weapons. And the idea, he'd been in ill health for a while, and I hadn't spoken to him for since QAnon started up, so I never really directly talked to him about to get a chuckle out of this Q nonsense. But the notion that somebody with a DOE clearance could show up at CIA headquarters in Langley, on the Parkway there, and just decide to go in and hang out and talk about what the Russians are up to. The idea that that's even remotely possible, it would be the end of his clearance in a nanosecond. That to be cleared for it at his level, and after decades of being a trustworthy keeper of secrets, at his level, to be cleared for anything that he wasn't currently cleared for was an extraordinarily difficult process. Right. So the notion that Q, as these idiots envision it, could actually exist, that somebody who had access to, quote, everything, is just so ludicrous that it's not even good fiction. It's the sort of thing that an 11-year-old boy reading young adult spy stories might believe. But anybody who has any actual connection with the military industrial complex knows just what a load of crap this is.
Exactly. If I might, I would say also that, because I tend to take any opportunity I can to throw pot shots in this general direction, especially the more that I learn about it, that we are we are not well enough warned, I suppose, by our young youthful education on the fact that almost every form of entertainment that we, TV, movies, podcasts, whatever, are complete fiction. Law shows, police procedurals, spy movies, all of this stuff. They are so grossly inadequately unrealistic that, and unfortunately, that tends to be the experience of a lot of people as to how they learn about or think these worlds or these areas operate. And it's just not even remotely close to what is represented on TV. That's entertainment, but people take that as though it's real. And it's a gross fallacy on the part of way too many people that they fall into that way of thinking and so become more easily susceptible to thinking something like, oh, because you have a top secret clearance, that means you have a universal clearance and you can see anything anywhere. And these kind of crazy ideas that just don't have anything to do with reality.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. And it's, the gullibility of large numbers of people for that reason and so many others is just extraordinary.
Yeah, it's really bad.
And so I think you've got. But what's interesting is that these groups are all splintering out of other groups. So the Queen of Canada, Negative 48, they're splintering off of QAnon. The Rise of the Moors is splintering off of regular Moors. And I think we're in a period where these giant umbrella conspiracies that gained momentum a couple of years ago, the anti-vax crowd is losing a lot of momentum. The money that was flowing into anti-vax groups now through COVID is sort of, well, not as deadly, but still sort of over. It's still out there. In fact, I'm just getting over a case myself. It was a bad cold, but, eminently, I was not concerned about dying particularly.
Right.
But I think that, the anti-vax movement was really rolling up a lot of followers, and that's fragmenting out in, people who were surfing that for, to create these groups. I think that's ending. QAnon is fragmenting. And so we're going to see a lot of little groups emerging very quickly and then probably disappearing just as quickly for the next couple of years before something else happens to change the direction of this.
Yeah. So, Queen of Canada. My goodness.
All right. So this is a pretty funny one because, like a lot of these things, well, let's step back. Okay, let me say this a little differently. So if we look at Scientology, when you get into it and you really study the doctrine, it's dreck. It can't possibly work.
Yep.
The quote, only hope for mankind is such a enormous, complex morass of Baroque complexity and contradictions. It couldn't possibly be that this stuff actually would be the only way for humankind to develop superpowers. Yeah. It's basically crap layered on top of crap. But what got people in was that some of it was somewhat plausible. You read Dianetics, and it's kind of maybe sort of plausible if you're like a college student and you don't really know much about this sort of thing. When you get in, you study it, and you realize that a lot of this was abreaction therapy that Jung and his cronies had rejected a half century earlier, including a predecessor of the e-meter, by the way. You realize that, this was stuff that had been left behind a long time ago, and it doesn't particularly work. Now, of course, when I say that, I always get nasty people saying, but I got tons of wins from auditing. And, the thing is, it's more likely that a small number of people get wins from auditing than that zero people do. And you have a nice, concerned, compassionate listener as you're going through all of this Baroque nonsense. Some people are going to get value out of that.
Yep.
There's a human and a listener in the loop.
That's right. It's a well of endless possibility when you have good communication going between people as to the feels that a person can get from that. And when you add, I'll have to say, in the auditing process, the trance induction and the covert hypnotism that occurs there, which has to be commented on as part of the process, then that's where it is so much easier to induce that awe, euphoria state that people are chasing in Scientology. And They can assign all kinds of interpretations to it, but at the end of the day, it's really about the feels,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and it's not hard to produce the feels in people. So that's, you know, kind of the way that gets by with these faulty, crazy, I love the way you put it, Baroque layer upon layer of dreck. It's perfect because that's exactly what it is. But people will believe anything if it's going to give them more of the feels.
Yep. But the thing, you know, to back up to the, you know, to the point is that there's some degree of plausibility on the way in that can overcome your skepticism.
Right.
You have to be quite ignorant and quite gullible to take some of the stuff that any of these groups we're talking about tonight, that any of the stuff that they believe, and believe that this really makes any sense at all.
That's right.
And so the thing about Q actually having access to all sorts of things is not even by far the most ludicrous thing that we'll talk about tonight. So Queen Romana declared herself the Queen of Canada early in 21, and she was a mildly successful QAnon interpreter that had a few tens of thousands of followers, mostly on Telegram. And so she declared herself the Queen of Canada and really took on COVID trying to eliminate masking, as many other people were doing at that point, right? If you look at early 21, it was the winter. A lot of people were dying. A lot of people were getting sick. A lot of, fairly draconian shutdowns of businesses, et cetera, et cetera. And so what she did is she wrote up these, quote, royal decrees and these cease and desist letters that her followers downloaded and printed out. And they started walking into government offices and businesses throughout Canada and threatening them with criminal prosecution for enforcing the legitimate mask mandates that were in effect. And this was seen as a threat. And these people were not, militia type, bearded gun. Well, not so much guns in Canada, but the sort that you would expect to be, heavy on the violence. These are little old ladies to a great extent. These are, suburban housewives. These are people, and they're casually, walking in and, threatening lengthy jail terms and potentially even worse. And so if you go back to the quote about the banality of evil, this is very much, that sort of thing. And so this is not, this is not people with a propensity of violence. It's just, they're just casually just threatening lengthy, decades long life in prison for, for asking you to wear something over your mouth so you don't infect other people.
Right.
Now, of course, earlier this year, as it looked like COVID was waning, the mission had to shift away from COVID. And so it had to evolve. Particularly because up in Canada, you had that truckers convoy going into Ottawa and jamming things up. And that was a much more publicized thing about, anti-mask. And so she was really in the shadow of that. So she had to evolve. And so the mechanism became more these royal decrees, and so basically the route that she took is free stuff. And so a lot of the royal decrees were, one of them was a $1.5 trillion investment in infrastructure development in Canada. Now, of course, 1.5 trillion Canadian dollars equals about 300 American dollars at the current exchange rate. But be that as it may, she wants $150 billion to go into the economy of the Yukon Territory, which I didn't bother to look it up, but I'm willing to bet is somewhat larger than the GDP of the Yukon Territory. So the notion that you could actually put that money to work is laughable.
Right.
It's not even remotely close to reality. It's just complete nonsense. Other royal decrees, let's see. The one that's really causing the most trouble is that all utilities are free: gas, electric, water, etc. And
okay, so to be clear, she's issuing policies or orders or decrees to her followers that they believe that they don't have to pay their utilities anymore.
Mm-hmm. Now, when she started throwing these out in like February or April, as you would expect, the rules are that people who don't pay over the course of the winter don't get turned off in February and freeze to death. They get turned off in June. So this works for a while. But what's happening is if you look at, there are people who monitor the Telegram channel and post this stuff on Twitter. Every day there's a few more people that have gotten turned off. They've spent that money on something else. They're on fixed incomes, and they can't pay the $2,000 or $3,000 that that it's going to take to get their utilities turned back on. And this is these senior citizens are have really screwed themselves massively into the ground. And the utility companies are starting to see enough of this that they know what's going on. They train their people, and basically, if you come in and you start talking about royal decrees, they're like, nope, doesn't work that way. And then they accelerate the cutoff process, send people out to the house, and but they've had people calling up the call centers, threatening the representatives by name, threatening them with their houses, going to the office and threatening people. So they're now trespassing people. And so now these little old ladies are subject to arrest if they set foot on the utility company's property or if they call again, for harassment. And this is a really, really bad situation, when this is happening, repeatedly. Other decrees in the free stuff vein are that she has rolled back real estate housing prices to the 1955 levels. That's 1955. So that's 70 years ago. And so a really nice house in a swanky area of Toronto will now cost about $4.17 US, at the current exchange rates. And it's just, it's completely insane. Mortgages are canceled. Canadian farmers can use all the water they want for free. Let's see, Canadian cities must operate community gardens to feed their entire population. You get 30 years in jail if you're a news medium that publishes fake news, according to her lights, all sorts of crazy stuff. And so these royal decrees are just, essentially whatever random thing that she sees that people are worried about, she issues a royal decree. And but people are using this to get themselves into real financial trouble. And of course, what she does is when people post, messages to her on Telegram, she just completely ignores them. She doesn't respond. She doesn't get drawn into it because that would really, that would really blow things up. So, this is a woman who basically, I don't know that much about her. I don't think that people have really done a deep dive into her past, but she does seem to have had some, skeevy marginal businesses where she stiffed a lot of creditors in the past. She was living in a really ratty, rundown, tenement in a bad neighborhood in Victoria, BC. And but she hadn't really had a money-making model until very recently. And so now what she's doing is she's going on tour of her dominion. She's getting her followers to kick in for a few RVs that she's renting and now ultimately purchasing. So she's now driving around Canada and hosting meet and greet sessions with her imperial presence. And she's now got followers who all have matching outfits, kind of reminiscent of the Heaven's Gate cult. And they are basically, and of course she's working them to death. A lot of them have quit and told stories about how awful she is. But basically that's what she's doing now, is starting to suck in donations.
Wow.
And so, I think that the propensity for violence, in these kinds of casual threats against the utility companies and so forth, I think is now being taken very seriously by the authorities. There was a post recently on Telegram from one of her followers who said that she has been trying to get the police in her town to intercede with the utility company for her because the utility company has now placed her as subject to arrest if she shows up or tries to call them. So, which is, I think, sort of not getting the point, really, that her bad actions have gotten her to this place. But, when you have enough people that are casually threatening violence, at some point somebody's going to do something.
That's right.
And so a relatively recent development with her followers is that they are now running clinics on how to do a, quote, citizen's arrest. And so this is, a fantasy that somehow that you can just arrest somebody as a citizen and haul them off to the police station. And, that's talk about old movie tropes and old TV fiction tropes that, like you were talking about earlier, that doesn't have any bearing in actual reality. And they've actually named a specific date and a specific city where they're going to effect one of these sometime This is August 2022. We'll see if it actually happens, but that would be, really over the line. Even if nobody gets hurt physically, the idea of essentially kidnapping somebody is really, getting very, very close to a line.
Absolutely. Well, they're already breaking the law in terms of, but at such a light level, nobody's particularly interested in throwing people in jail. But they start doing this stuff, and that's going to change real fast.
Yes, it is. Even in Canada now, she's already been. You can insert all the jokes about socialized Canadian medicine because they did call her in for a mental health competency exam a while ago, and they didn't hold her. Even though I'm sure they think that she's I think she's pretty clinical. She's pretty delusional. She's pretty clinical.
Yeah.
But they didn't hold her. But they're certainly, she is up on the radar scope. There are often police in the background observing at these meet and greet events, not right in their face, but they're there. But I think, it's morphing again. I think very rapidly right now. There's two things that have come up in the last maybe month or two. One is that she's resurrecting a lot of this new age nonsense called ascended masters. And this tends to be, a bunch of, look it up. It's not. I don't.
Well, I'll actually put a link here in the show notes description to the video here to my interviews with Joe Szimhart, who's an expert on that and actually has talked in detail about Madame Blavatsky and 19th century mysticism and the occult, which was a springboard for some of this ascended masters lore. And this is a very, very, very old idea, very old. And this is regurgitated, resuscitated from time to time by various cults and twisted and turned. Hubbard did it. Lots of other new age spiritual groups do it. And it's, it has to do with this business of ascended masters. It's you are at a higher state of existence or knowledge or ability, and you promise to have your followers be able to rise to that occasion themselves by following you and doing what you say. And it's quite a powerful carrot for people who have felt powerless their entire lives, and they tend to glom onto this kind of thing. So what's old is new and brought back again.
Yeah, I had a very interesting series of discussions, and I haven't been given permission to say who it is, but somebody that you would know and that's very prominent ex-Scientologist is the child of a mother who was very heavily into this stuff.
Yep.
And it really messed her up, and she has said that it made her susceptible to Scientology. And, but it really just, it was a horrifically traumatic part of her childhood. So it's, and it has been, I think, kind of gone away, but she, the Queen of Canada is really bringing this back. And so she's using the I am verbiage and a lot of the buzzwords from that. And I think what that does, even though the Ascended Master stuff, I think that one of the biggest groups was the Church Universal and Triumphant, which has kind of fallen apart. But that was very right-wing survivalist expression. So I think, some of the Ascended Master stuff is not, far left, loopy, hippie, dippy, stereotypical New Age. There's a lot of paranoia and such. But it does broaden the appeal versus sitting there and, if you're at all a Democrat, QAnon is against you because that's the enemy, the satanic, baby-eating, adrenochrome harvesting Democratic pedophiles. And so, QAnon's appeal is somewhat limited to a particular part of the political spectrum, whereas Ascended Masters, at least ostensibly, is a much broader appeal. So
that's right, because you can morph it to any ideology you want.
Exactly. And so, you're not, as time goes on, the people whose lives revolve around the election was stolen from Trump 2 years ago, it's getting a little harder to kind of keep people at the level of intensity to stay engaged with that. And so, these groups have had to evolve to somewhat less political. The anti-vax stuff was absolutely perfect for that because it united a lot of people across the political spectrum with a common fear. And so she's doing this Ascended Master stuff. And I don't know quite how it's going to shake out, but it's very interesting to see how fast that she's putting all this together. I don't know if she was into it before and is now just sort of bringing it into the mix of doctrine or of whatever. I wouldn't even call it doctrine, because this is all just like shit that's thrown against the wall, and they just are seeing, you know, these leaders are seeing what sticks. But it's, I think is, you know, I think it's going to become an increasing part of the mix, but we'll see how far that goes.
Yeah. But just as a quick comment on that, in case anybody out there is kind of wondering, in terms of the cult milieu or the cult modeling or how this works, this is par for the course. There's nothing unusual in having things thrown against the wall to see what sticks. Hubbard did it all through the 1950s. And it wasn't until 10, 12 years into Scientology that things started becoming standardized. And up until then, you had all kinds of things thrown in there that, and some of which survived and some of which didn't. And so this is the same kind of phenomenon we see here.
Yeah, and so it's almost like, you know, she's got the audience, and now she's got to have the doctrine to sell to them.
That's
Whereas at the very least, Hubbard wrote Dianetics before he went out and started to collect followers and turn it into what it is today. But here you get the audience, and now you got to have something to keep them hooked. And so it's a big scramble to get this stuff rounded up. So stealing from the past, no matter how ludicrous, is certainly a unifying thread for the groups we're talking about, and more besides. But the second major development that's really started to happen in the last few weeks is that she's trying to export this kingdom idea to the United States. So she found some guy, and I don't think people have really been able to find out much about him, but one of her followers, she has named the Commander-in-Chief of the United States. And by the way, she claims that her legitimacy, speaking of commanders-in-chief, comes from the United States government, which is kind of interesting from, you know, when you consider that she's the Queen of Canada. So, you know, that she seems to be a little unclear on the concept that apparently the United States military endorses her. Guantanamo Bay is available for her to put prisoners of people who cross her in. Last time I checked, that was a U.S. Navy operation. And really the Canadians, you know, have steered clear of any involvement with Guantanamo,
right.
You know, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some very ludicrous beliefs about, you know, her legitimacy deriving from the U.S. So it's natural that she's expanding there. And what she's actually doing is creating an organization. So this commander-in-chief guy, they're also recruiting state leaders, you know, to set up organizations. I don't think there's any actual template for setting up organizations, but she's handing this out as plums to some of her followers to say, okay, well, you're now the leader of Arkansas, and you're going to spread my kingdom into the U.S. And so there's actually an organization of sorts filling in. So this is going to be really interesting to see if she's able to morph to actually run an organization.
Yeah.
Now, we've seen pretend government organizations from sovereign citizens in the United States. Probably the best example I know of is one from run by a lady out of Alaska named Anna Reisinger, little old lady who is one of these pretend judge, pretend grand jury types. And she now has a thing called the American States Assembly. And basically, you know, they have to pretend to have their legislatures and their law, you know, lawmakers and all this according to Anna's rules. And of course, if you don't pretend according to her rules, she kicks you out of the pretend government. So, you know, there's it'll be very interesting when some of these other pretend government groups start to pick at the Queen of Canada usurping their livelihoods. And it'll be very interesting to see, you know, the hissing and spitting. You know, I think, by the way, Life of Brian is really becoming a documentary for these times. Right.
I tell you, it feels like if you take Life of Brian and Idiocracy and sort of put it, you know, it's like, what are we talking about with these things?
Yeah. And I mean, you know, all you have to do is just say, you know, the Judean People's Front versus the People's Front of Judea.
Right.
And you get a sense of what's likely to go on with these things. So that's one particularly, you know, raucous bit of insanity.
Right. Wow. Well, it certainly is. And, of course, with the police kind of watching now and with, them the incursion, I guess you could say, into the United States, I don't know that the United States bureaucracies are going to act any faster than Canada has on this. They're a little slow to roll. But as we've seen with the sovereign citizen movement, once they do become aware of the tricks and what these people are up to, they have very, very short tolerance for it.
Yeah, no, I think it is an open switch what the U.S. is going to do here.
Yeah.
I haven't been able to find much substantiation, but I have seen comments by the people that follow her closely that says that she has been trying to get into the U.S., but apparently they're on to her. And so she has not been able to get in on her own passport, and she may have potentially tried to use other passports, maybe perhaps of followers or some other means to attempt to circumvent, but apparently she is not able to get into the U.S. Her followers have also been identified. The police are probably, they've had police contacts. Some of the drivers have been ticketed. So I think the identities of most of her key, followers that are traveling with her are known. And I think that the U.S. has basically got enough of her number that they're going to keep her out for a while. It may or may not, stand for the long term. But I think that's very quietly, I think that's the strategy. I think they're better at monitoring social media perhaps than most people think. And I'm sure she's up on the radar scope, especially with all these,
Oh, very much so. Yeah. I mean, because when you're literally attacking the sovereignty of a country directly, that's called treason. And, they do take a rather dim view of that in the post 9/11 world.
Yeah, I just think I think she's up on the radar scope, and I think they're just hoping if they keep her out, it's not going to be their problem,
right?
And that the Canadians, I think, are perhaps going to reach, if there's any violence, I think the Canadians are going to really come clamping down pretty hard,
right?
More so than is typical. I think after the truckers convoy in Ottawa, I think the Canadian government's patience is a bit. Has worn a bit thin for this sort of garbage.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, and so then -48. That is a bizarre name. This is some guy, right? Michael Protzman?
Yep. Yeah. So I have no idea what the genesis of the name is. And, I'm going to use that term, or I'm going to use Michael Protzman as the name, because the group doesn't really have a name. But he's another QAnon guy. He had more followers, I think, than the Queen of Canada. And his shtick in the QAnon world, they got him those followers, was really the use of gematria. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but the Bible code, the numerology stuff.
Oh, right, because he's got this whole system with A = 1, B = 2, and so on, and they use that to connect dots in some bizarre conspiracy way.
Right, and so this goes back. This is almost medieval, or maybe even older in its incarnation. And there was a book maybe 20 or 30 years ago called the Bible Code that maybe not the best term, resurrected this nonsense, and that if you somehow assign these magical values to various letters of the Hebrew alphabet and somehow randomly picked the right letters in the right places, you would get messages about the future. And
the brilliance of that system is you can literally, I mean, it's not even like like you have to strain. You can find any message you want anywhere you want if you just massage those numbers.
Absolutely. So, I think it's, I don't know that it necessarily takes particular skill to come up with, a way to run this scam. This guy is like a contractor, a demolition contractor from Washington State. So, probably not a math genius that can look at a page of text and somehow compute the numbers in his head. So I don't know how, if you were going to try to run this scam on people, how you would do it. But, it's obvious that, exactly as you say, if you cherry pick it, there's an old saying in economics, right? If you torture the data long enough, it will ultimately confess. And
that's very accurate. Yeah.
And so, I think that there's an element of that. But I think ultimately one of the, we've talked before about, especially like in our Scientology podcast a couple of weeks ago, we've talked about how cults sell certainty. And this numerology stuff is perhaps the ultimate kind of certainty, right? That events of today were foreshadowed at some point in the past in these sacred writings. And the idea that, the tribulations and the suffering of today are ultimately going to be worth it because they were so important that they were foreseen, some long period of time ago.
That's right.
And so, the idea is, that's a very powerful concept. And when you think about it, you think about the fact that the U.S. has been through a kind of trauma on both sides of the political spectrum for the last 5 years. The anti-Trump people have been driven nuts by this stuff, and the pro-Trump people have been driven nuts for the last 2 years by this fantasy that the election was stolen.
Yep.
And so there's been this enormous national trauma. And then you have inflation, which is something now happening for the last 2 years and likely to continue, that hasn't been a factor in the economy for 40 years. Not that many people remember the 70s, but inflation became benign in the early 80s and has remained so, ever since. And that's gonna not be the case for a while. You have the situation in Ukraine, which very possibly could erupt into a major conflict. If any number of things go wrong, and this very much could. And you have the potential for a major conflict in China. And while I believe that the U.S. would ultimately and its allies would ultimately prevail in both of those, it's still a very, very, tense time geopolitically. And there's a lot of concern about the future, more so than there maybe was 20 years ago or even 5 years ago.
Well, I'm just going to add on top of that the other layer of climate change and the climate science, which is the articles that come out even up to today on my news feed are very alarmist on that topic and are very concerning to an awful lot of people. Yeah, we talk about climate deniers, but there's an awful lot of people out there who are not climate deniers who are very concerned about this.
Well, I just read today, in England, they've had this heat wave, and the first time in recorded history, the source for the River Thames has run dry. I don't know exactly what that means, downstream over the next couple of weeks, but, there's some unprecedented stuff going on, and it seems to be happening. It's not just, this theoretical thing like the Greenland ice caps are shrinking or glaciers or, whatever. It's stuff that, really is affecting, agricultural production. And by the way, if you look at the fact that Ukraine is a major source of grain to the Middle East and a bunch of other places, and both Ukraine and Russia are major exporters of fertilizer, you have some very legitimate concerns about massive global famine. We're talking hundreds of millions of people, maybe a billion or more people at risk within the next 12 months from food insecurity on a scale that we haven't seen in a very long time. So, really you can, really given the level of sort of background strain, I mean, I've been following a lot of geopolitics at work, and I got to tell you, I am way more stressed since the Ukraine thing started. And I've been looking at all kinds of stuff and scenarios for all kinds of things. I'm not a geopolitical guy, but I got sucked into this, unfortunately. I'm a tech guy. I'm not a geopolitics guy. And, but I got sucked into this for a whole bunch of reasons, but I didn't want to be, but I have to be. And, I got to tell you, my background stress level, is just off the frickin' charts. I've had more sleepless nights the last 6 months than I have in a while. And I'm generally a reasonably balanced individual, and, reasonably centered, but it's just like,
yeah, I hear you. I wish I could say that I've been able to just blow it all off, but I have not. I have been just as concerned. And it's concerning. And the point being, of course, that, if you and I are legit concerned because we are reasoned individuals who pay attention to the data, you got a whole bunch of people who don't know anything about the data, don't pay attention, but are, riled up and fall for this nonsense as the reason why it's happening or what they can do about it. And that always happens historically during times of civil or social tumult. And,
And so what's Protzman's essential shtick here is that JFK will return, and that he will be reincarnated, and he will return Trump to power. Now, of course, Never mind the fact that JFK was the ultimate Democrat, and the likelihood that he's somehow going to be reincarnated as a Republican and still be JFK seems a bit surprising, to be mildly skeptical. And, this was supposed to happen on November 2nd of last year. It didn't. He moved the date about 300, some large number of times. And of course, it's the classic cognitive dissonance trap that goes back to Festinger in the 50s.
That's
with
right.
the UFO cult in Chicago, all that sort of crap. So very classic cognitive dissonance trap. So there were like a couple thousand people that came to Dallas to witness this on his say-so. And of course, a lot of them, after the first disappointment, rolled out and went back to their lives. But he's got maybe 100 hardcore followers. He's still got all of these people on his social media, chat, Telegram channel or whatever it is his primary vector. A lot of those people are sending him money, but a lot of the people that are following him around, and basically what he's doing with the time, is when he's, aside from the doctrine, but what people are doing with their days that are following him is they basically are schlepping around the country to Trump rallies, waiting for JFK to be revealed as their for Trump to be revealed as the reincarnation of JFK.
Right.
And which again is just insane.
And they're supposed to connect up with JFK Jr. as well, who didn't really die in that plane crash and is going to partner up with Dad again or something. Yeah.
Yeah. The fact, the details don't matter. So somebody who's more familiar in the comments, it's like, yeah, okay, I may have gotten this slightly wrong, but basically, this fusion of JFK Jr., Senior, reincarnated as Trump, the restoring Trump to power, all this sort of nonsense is just ludicrous.
Yeah.
But some of the followers, these people have cut themselves off from their family, and they've run up astronomical credit card bills. I saw one article about a woman who, married to a doctor, prosperous family, and she's looted the family, fortune to the tune of a couple $100,000 that she's given him for hotel bills for all these people that are schlepping around the country. And so there are a lot of people that have had to cut their spouses off from the credit cards and leave them potentially indigent because, they're driving the family into bankruptcy. They've disconnected from their families. I don't want to talk to you. This is the truth. And, these people have literally gone, around the bend. And speaking of going around the bend, to return to the numerology part for a second, what essentially numerology is an example of a phenomenon called apophenia. And that is the recognition of patterns where patterns don't really exist. Exactly. And this is a very natural, and it's very, common. Everybody does it, right? You look at a cloud and you see a dog, or you see a boat, or you see a something in the cloud. That's pretty much universal. It's a survival characteristic, right? You hear a noise in the grass and you look for a pattern that may be a predator. Right. As opposed to going, oh, that sounds musical and pleasant, and then the leopard pounces. Right. So we still have that wired in, but there's, an immense spectrum of this. And so, you have just, this sort of random pattern matching that, of overgeneralizing these patterns. And this doesn't come from the frontal lobes, by the way. It comes from, sort of lower down in what I would call the monkey brain rather than the frontal lobes, which are the part that makes us human. And this kind of, there's a very good model in terms of the different parts of the brain and their roles in some of the books that you could read about PTSD and how trauma works and bypasses the normal logic and reasoning. And so this is very much wired at a reflex level. And then sometimes it comes into places where it affects other people. So this is where you get somebody who sees the face of Jesus in a slice of toast, and then all the people in the neighborhood come in and worship or whatever. So you get some ability to affect people. And then, at the extreme end, one of the key markers of schizophrenia is high degree of this characteristic of seeing, patterns where none exist. And, when you think about schizophrenia, about 0.5% of the population in the U.S., and a little bit less globally, but about 0.5% in the U.S., or 1.6 or 1.7 million people are schizophrenics, whether diagnosed or not. That's a pretty significant number. Mm-hmm. But because this is a smooth continuum, there's a lot of people that are somewhat schizophrenic adjacent, that this apophenia is very, very strong. And so you're going to see a lot of people who are perhaps marginal with mental health getting hooked into this numerology stuff because it really satisfies that urge, that overactive urge to find patterns. And it really, that to a certain extent, I think, with all these people that were puzzling about these Q drops and, analyzing all this crap back in the early days of Q, I think that's, so you really are appealing to people who are, potentially borderline mentally ill. And that's why I think, I don't know, and I'm going to be very speculative here, but I think that, people who are close to being mentally ill can in fact be kicked over the edge. And it can in fact, the obsessively looking for patterns can trigger schizophrenia, and not just the other way around.
Oh no, I'll absolutely double down on that. And the reason I'll say that, and I'll put some beef there, is you have social factors. Group peer pressure is everything to your beliefs. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's why these groups are become like these self-generating kind of things, is reinforcing, I should say. And the other factors there are sleep deprivation, food deprivation, mm-hmm. trauma, stress, anxiety, right? We use these words to describe mental states where people are in a kind of permanent or semi-permanent fight, flight, fright mode, whatever, where they're just not rationally, calmly thinking things through. And if you dial that pattern making, that connect dots that don't connect up to 11, like we do with cults, with these added layers of trouble, then this is where you get this phenomena from. Yeah. So this is not even that conjectural. It fits completely in with everything we talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I have, it makes sense, and I think it's a reasonable bet. I haven't seen enough data. I haven't gone looking for it one way or to confirm or disconfirm. Yeah. But looking for fMRI type, biochemical data to see that. Because you can see differences in the brains of schizophrenics and how they process certain things. Right. And so I haven't seen fMRI data to see when longitudinally somebody has started doing this and all of a sudden their neurochemistry proves. So that's why I'm treating it as a speculative comment, even though I think it's a reasonable working assumption. That's my normal sort of mode of caution.
Of course.
So let's keep, I'm going to just knock through a couple of Protzman's bizarre beliefs. Like many cult leaders, when they start to get attention, especially in person, he's now thinking that he may be the reincarnation of Jesus. That's pretty common, and it's, I think, characteristic of how cults actually harm the cult leaders. Not that I'm feeling sorry for him, but Hubbard was kind of a mess after all of these years of adoration from his fans. I think he was probably relieved in some sense to go into seclusion, to hide from the long arm of the law. I think he was probably somewhat better off for not having all these people after him all the time, to try to, like all of the people chasing Brian around in Life of Brian, waving sandals.
That's right. That's right. It creates its own kind of, it's a whole other level of problems at the cult leader level.
Yeah. Other juicy tidbits, that drinking hydrogen peroxide is the best cure for COVID. So this is like, talk about going to 11. That's way beyond ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. Drinking hydrogen peroxide is a really bad idea. It's up there, maybe even worse than drinking your own urine. Not quite as bad as drinking bleach, like some of these other guys have been talking about, but it's up there. He's had some suicidal or apocalyptic rhetoric, like you have to die to learn the truth. That's a little concerning. That's sort of in and out. I don't think that's a major theme, but it's been, some comments before. One of the, as he kind of, the JFK thing is I think wearing thin. He now says, well, Trump looks a little rumpled at some of these appearances because the high-tech mask that prevents him from being revealed as JFK, he's intentionally letting that slip. And, the revelation of Trump as the reincarnation of JFK or JFK Jr. is imminent. Let's see. Another one is he believes that at the last Trump rally that he was at in the front row, that as Trump walked off stage, that Trump looked at him and said, "Thank you, Michael." And he's now announcing that Trump will thank him by name for the immense contributions he's making to the world in his next rally. That'll work out. And then another recent development is that, like the Queen of Canada, Protzman is very big on med beds. So if you haven't heard of med beds, this is a magical Star Trek-like thing. Apparently, a lot of people think that these are invented by aliens and that they are being given to the people of Earth. You lie on a med bed for some brief period of time and it cures cancer, regrows missing limbs, cures Alzheimer's, any disease, any chronic condition that you have, the med bed will instantly take it away. As an aside, not related to Protzman, I'm seeing several people now starting up websites to take $400 to get a reservation for your med bed treatment, which is really, I think, the worst kind of crime. And you see these very sad, requests to Queen Romana about when are the med beds going to be available? My sister is dying of cancer.
Wow.
And,
that was that reminds me of that movie Elysium, that Matt Damon, Jodie Foster movie. They had a med bed in that movie. It's a key plot point. The rich people had it.
Yeah.
And
well,
people,
Star Trek's, Dr. McCoy,
right.
goes back to Dr. McCoy, and I don't want to know what Dr. McCoy and Nurse Chapel did in their med bed, but and so it's again, but that's a very new age kind of fantasy, with benevolent space aliens out there taking care of us. Now, of course, the idea of withholding a med bed, if humans had the ability to function as gatekeepers, is ludicrous. I looked this up. I wrote about this on Tony Ortega's blog a while ago. So globally, the world spends about 12% of GDP, or about maybe $12 trillion a year on medical care. The U.S. is a slightly higher percentage because our healthcare system is so inefficient. And so if I had a warehouse full of med beds, what I would do, instead of holding them back for some unspecified future thing to happen, kind of like David Miscavige is holding back OT 9 and 10, I would go to the government and say, since med beds will put all of the healthcare people in your industry out of business, how about you pay me the same amount of your GDP for med beds that I will rent you? And so all of a sudden I own a $12 trillion a year business, and I am, at reasonable stock market valuation multiples, the richest person that ever lived, and I am that way overnight.
Right.
So I would have a very powerful incentive to bring med beds to people, because the amount of money, and I could even charge a premium to what people are currently spending. So it's like, okay, give me 20% of GDP for med beds, because now everybody will live for a long time and they could be taxpayers for longer, and they will spend money and pump up the economy for many more years.
Right. This is really the whole Raiders of the Lost Ark, hide it in some deep warehouse somewhere, government conspiratorial. They had a cure for cancer from the 1950s and they've been hiding it. It's this really bizarre, paranoid kind of thinking.
Well, yeah, and it's something that's like almost a repentance fantasy, right? That if we're somehow good enough and that we're somehow virtuous enough on axes that aren't explained to us, but if we just act virtuous enough, then this paradise on earth will be awarded to us,
right.
and everything will be better. Mm-hmm. And so this is very new age magical thinking, and so Protzman is a very big believer in that. So I think that's just more and more just random crap that all of a sudden the synapse fires, and it's like that's added to the stack of doctrine. Yeah. But I think the med beds are particularly significant because, again, it's broadening beyond just, so if you're anti-Trump, now there's a hook to get you in. And I don't think that these guys are pretty marginal intellectually. I don't think these guys are sitting there thinking, I need a way to broaden my market appeal, right? Top-down MBA strategic thinking type stuff. I don't think they're doing that. I think they just sort of intuitively know, that they could just sort of randomly, intuitively say, well, that's a good piece of doctrine to add to the mix. But I don't think they're approaching it, the way I would sort of, if I were trying to start a cult, and I would, apply my Wall Street wisdom and say, we need to have the broadest addressable market.
That's right. That's right. I think you'll find, if we do ever get into the details of these things, I think you're going to find that a lot of these ideas and appendages and things that add to the mythology or the mix come from the followers. You know, they have conversations. I mean, Hubbard came up with a good chunk, but far from all of Scientology. Tons of people, hundreds of people, if not thousands, contributed substantially to the Scientology cosmology, techniques, processes, all of it. But all of it has Hubbard's byline on it, right? It's all Hubbard, but it wasn't.
But it's like, and it's not just the quote, the tech, it's the organizational structure. Right? So there were a lot of people that were demanding ethics to have the other people that were undermining Scientology punished so that they could, you know, suppress their own doubts.
That's right.
So I think one of the best examples in a microcosm of how that evolved, of how, you know, the members started contributing to their own entrapment, is that legendary story from the 60s called The Third Wave, about that experiment in a high school in Palo Alto, California.
Oh, yeah. I've been meaning to do a show on that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this is absolutely mandatory reading to go back and look at the experiment and look at the stories. There are some relatively shorter treatments, and there are some documentaries and some longer treatments, interviews with some of the kids in there. But the spontaneous authoritarian cult emerged in a week.
That's right.
In a high school. And what was scary, and what really finally caused the teacher to pull the plug, is that the kids were starting to come up with ways to punish other kids, to police and punish themselves. And so they were contributing essentially to their own enslavement. And that's that's a truly scary phenomenon. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right that I'm sure a lot of this stuff is bubbling up from the followers, whether it's the people actually with him or people on Telegram or his other reading of his quote competitors on Telegram. And so there's a lot of ferment that's going on there. And in fact, there's so much ferment that there are now splinter groups from Negative 48. There are 2 or 3 that have some longevity and some size of their own, and they're all running around filing restraining orders against each other for all sorts of People's Front of Judea versus Judean People's Front type reasons.
Exactly.
But it gets pretty vicious, and I think this one is concerning. Right? So we talk about the potential for violence. This one is concerning because this looks, the comments about that you have to die in order to see the truth, and some of this other stuff, and the potential for violence among these different splinter groups. Maybe not as great as the sort of banal violence that Queen Romana is talking about in the first example here, and certainly not even remotely close to the level of violence potential from the ones we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But this is still, fairly concerning. As I think there's more of a predilection for violence now, casually around, when some of these promises become unfulfilled.
Desperation levels get higher, and people get lots more anxious and on edge.
Yep.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right. And it needs to be commented on. I do need to insert here just to again reinforce what we're talking about here, that this is why I talk about cults being a codependent relationship between the leader and the followers.
Very much so.
Right? It's not just the leader abusing all the followers. That's very much part of the model. But the followers are actively participating in this, rationalizing all of it, and enabling every single piece of it. And that's a hard pill to swallow for some people, because it's true that there's victimization and abuse and nonsense. And I'm certainly not talking about children here when I'm talking about enabling the cult leader. But when I talk about the adult membership, people who should absolutely know better, giving over all authority to these people, that's an enabling relationship, and they're responsible for that too.
Yep.
We got to look hard at that, Yeah.
Now the other thing that sort of completes the vicious cycle with the cults is the cults also define the leaders, and you didn't necessarily start out to have a cult, and then people are looking to you as this perfect guru. And you know who you are inside. You're a sham. You're not that sacred person.
That's right.
And then you start, becoming more and more erratic to try to, keep up the illusion so that they don't all go away. And you end up, you end up being kind of a mess yourself.
That's right. That's right.
As I said before, not that I'm sorry for cult leaders, but but that ultimately feeds back into the organization. That as the leader decompensates, so too does the organization become more extreme, trying to keep up the illusion and so forth.
Exactly. And the other point I'll put in here is, we see the levels of nonsense here: the illogical reasoning, the motivated reasoning, the cognitive dissonance, all the labels. This is why I say you're not going to argue somebody out of this. Whether it's Scientology, -48, whatever, they're deep in, and it's that emotional attachment, that commitment. They're all in. So that's why if you're outside looking in on this, don't think you're going to go have some conversation and it's all going to get resolved. It doesn't. It definitely doesn't work that way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that the denouement, for example, the Scientology, you get sucked into the Sea Org, you spend, large numbers of years in. And while some people who get out of Scientology after that kind of treatment will go cult hopping and end up in some other group, I think a lot of people are going to be, so they're going to be avoiding any contact with anything else that could be remotely like that. But given that this stuff is a much shorter cycle time between the rise of the group and the positive, community feeling before it starts to all turn to shit, you're going to see a lot of cycles of cult hopping from some of these people.
Yes.
Some of them may pull out, before they get really totally invested. But when these groups who are going to have a much shorter life than Scientology or the Moonies start to implode, these people are going to go back to the well of social media and they're going to find some other group. To a much higher degree than perhaps than we've seen with cult hopping before.
Yeah, exactly. And I hope I didn't get across there, in my last point on this, especially with what you just said about cult hopping, because I think you're absolutely right. That there's nothing you can do. I'm just saying that, it's not a simple Simon solution here. These are not reasonable people.
Yeah, you can't sort of give them the scientific truth and expect the forebrains. Because, as we've talked about, this is happening down at the monkey brain level.
Yep.
And the forebrain is not functioning when you're stuck in the monkey brain, whether it's a traumatic response or this kind of, burgeoning mental illness.
That's right.
And so, you're absolutely right. I don't know what the answer is, but
it's unfortunately complicated. Yeah.
Yeah.
So social, that's why, from a social perspective or from a country or state level or county level, the solutions do not involve individual interventions on each member. It's, we got to just control and corral these people, because the job of individually dealing with the psychoses or irrationality or delusions or whatever you want to call it, or whatever you're having to deal with on a person by person level, it's complicated. Right. So we have to exert social control first and then get into, okay, now let's pick up each person, if we can even do that and have the resources for it. And frankly, our society isn't really structured that way.
Yeah. Now, I think and this is not a great solution, but, the propensity of these groups increasingly to move toward violence essentially provides a pathway at tremendous cost, indeed, in terms of the victims of this violence, but it provides a catalyst for the law enforcement to roll these people up more quickly than perhaps in the past.
Yes.
And, they don't have time to create an organizational structure like Scientology that allows them to operate with impunity. They don't have the money that Scientology does. And, there's a clear and present danger to public safety, physical safety, that would justify, coming in and rolling them up, as opposed to just being a bunch of kooks chanting on street corners and soliciting money. So, given the overall concern about extremist violence in this country, the increasing staffing, law enforcement to deal with that, that provides a pathway. And as I say, it's not a hope, but it's because it comes at such a cost. But that is a potential that is going to allow, the groups that do turn violent, or at least the individuals that turn violent, to get rolled up. And I think that some of these groups, that's enough of a catalyst that wakes people up. So, we talked 3 years ago about the Colorado sovereign citizen pretend grand jury crowd that got rolled up after they started putting liens on the properties of government officials that they felt had wronged them. They're all now serving decades-long jail sentences. And once they started actually putting these people in jail, all of the marginal followers basically disappeared, and the whole thing just went away. And so I think once to use the phrase, when shit gets real, a lot of people are going to get flushed out of this. There's still going to be some true believers. This happened with the Nexium sex cult in upstate New York when Keith Raniere, the founder, got arrested in 2018 in Mexico. The organization didn't have a lot of people on the payroll. And so the organization folded almost immediately. There are still a couple of dozen hardcore believers out there that are still trying to get Raniere sprung on appeal, not likely to be successful. So there's a couple of hardcore believers, but the whole thing got rolled up pretty quickly once shit got real.
That's right. And one of the things, and I'm going to be sad to say this, but I don't think it's a biased statement. I mean, you know how I feel about organized religion, but the law tends to, these groups we're talking about are not religious groups. They don't have religious protections. And so it's a lot easier to see, and unfortunately a lot easier to roll them up than we see with religious groups who are, for example, automatically granted tax exemption in the United States unless you can make a case otherwise. Yeah. So, this is also one of the things about these groups we're talking about is these are non-religious cults.
Yeah. And, I think these, let's circle back on this in this sort of conclusion. Let's talk about the rise of the Moors, and then let's circle back and talk about the economics of, what are these people in business for?
Right.
And is it even a business, or is it just a random cash grab? And, Scientology is a business that throws off a lot of money, but it throws off more money because it's a business. And this is all just casual, random stuff. And so we'll talk about that's an important contrast between older groups and this wave of stuff that's arising. All right, so let's talk about our third group. This has less in common with the Queen of Canada and with Negative 48, Michael Protzman, but it is an emerging trend that does have, when we dig into it, some common threads. And so I think it's worth studying. And this is a militia group called the Rise of the Moors. And this is a splinter off of kind of more mainstream Moorish sovereign citizens. So the Moorish sovereign citizen ideology borrows a lot from other sovereign citizen groups, but it's almost exclusively Black, African-American members. And the unifying doctrine, or, the key doctrine is that the Moors, or the Black North Africans, were the original inhabitants of North America. And because of the 1786 Treaty of Friendship with Morocco and the Barbary pirates, they are exempted from U.S. laws. So that's their magic entree into the world of not having to have car insurance and so forth.
Got it.
So there's actually a ton of videos of people, of sovereign citizens in general, getting pulled over for bogus license plates and bogus driver's licenses and no insurance, and getting their windows broken and getting yanked out of their cars and getting tased and et cetera. But there are plenty of, Moorish sovereign citizens with some of these clever license plates. And if you look at the artwork, you follow some of this on Twitter, or some of the people that follow these, some of the academics that follow these guys, there are some pretty artistic efforts for license plates and fake IDs and whatnot. And I think one of the things that delights me the most is that they now are increasingly putting out their pseudo-legal gibberish in fake Old English spelling, which is a relatively recent development. And so there's a lot to chuckle about, with the Moors in general. But there are some darker elements. So we're still talking about, in general, Moorish sovereign citizens. One of the things that some Moorish groups have done is they have started squatting in and attempting to steal houses by filing fake paperwork, fake transfers of title, and so forth. So they'll often break into a house that's for sale, that's empty. They'll change the locks and they'll just set up camp. And then they'll file bogus paperwork to own it. And it's surprising. You think you can't just walk in and file this paperwork. You actually, in a lot of places, you can. When you file a transfer of title, it's presumed valid. So there's no way, there's no real check. You could just say, no, that's my house now, and make up some bogus paperwork, and then unrolling all of that, and then actually getting people out once they're physically in a dwelling is actually surprisingly difficult in a lot of places. It's a wonder that, in some cases, these people show up with paperwork at an inhabited dwelling, push their way in, and physically throw the owners out. And there have been stories of that. So these guys seem to be more aggressive than other sovereign groups about boosting real estate.
Wow.
And so that's
it's so audacious. It's so out there. It's so inconceivable. And that is bizarrely how some of these over-the-top personalities, dare I say Trump and on down, get away with this. It's just so audacious. It assaults your sense of civility in society.
Yeah. And, the thing is that they've discovered that it's surprisingly hard to undo, so that they, while I think people are starting to come down much harder on these, especially the squatters in vacant houses. It's like, if they just get the guy out, so that they can, sell the house, the homeowner, especially if it's a commercial real estate operator, is just going to be like, just get this done. They're not going to want to necessarily press charges. So in the past, maybe it's been, just kind of like you get a free house for a while until they get around to throwing you out. And it's that kind of a scam. But, I think that they're now starting to push some serious jail time for these people. And, you are seeing them get sentenced. So it is a pretty audacious and, pretty huge crime.
Yeah.
And, especially when they're busting into an inhabited house. And it's really hard to, it takes months sometimes to go through the process. You can't the cops don't just sit there, come in, send in a SWAT team and throw these guys back out. It's harder than it seems.
Right.
So that's kind of a moderately dangerous thing. And the fact that some of them haven't gotten shot by homeowners, is potentially, especially in, states that are more gun friendly, is perhaps remarkable. But those guys have nothing until you get to the Rise of the Moors. So the Rise of the Moors is a group out of Providence, Rhode Island, and they, are relatively small, and they made a name for themselves in July of 2021 when they were going as a militia group. They were going up to Maine, which is Maine is a very rural state. There's there's a lot of empty land. There's the population density is the lowest in the eastern half of the U.S. And so there are places in Maine that are very remote. So they had some land apparently, and they were going up there to shoot guns and do quote training as a militia group. So the way that they got, came to attention is that in north of Boston, in the rural area on the way up I-95, in the middle of the night, they were stopped, multiple SUVs by the side of the road, with their flashers on, and they were filling up gas in their cars from gas cans. So a local PD guy stops to see if he can render assistance, and he is met with 11 people in tactical gear and multiple sidearms carrying automatic weapons, standing there, in the middle of the night, standing there holding guns. Now, in Massachusetts, that's a really bad idea. Massachusetts has some of the strictest gun control laws, but here's this cop surrounded by armed black men, and he calls for reinforcements, and they send a whole shitload of reinforcements. These guys all scatter into the woods. There's video of one of the leaders saying, okay, you go over there, take up a sniper position. So this is looking like it's heading towards a very potential shootout, that this is going to be, World War III in rural Massachusetts in the middle of the night. And eventually they roll these guys up. Wow. They get them. It takes hours to go tramping through the woods, send out the dogs, and catch all these guys and arrest them. There's been, some of them are representing themselves. Most of them actually are representing themselves with all the usual sovereign citizen nonsense. So unfortunately, mass court records are a little hard to find online, and so I don't know the exact status, but they're still basically awaiting trial. So they've been moldering in jail for a year.
Especially when their responses are written in Old English.
Oh yeah, exactly. And so, it's the usual, nonsense, and they're filing that, nonsensical lawsuits and, doing all the usual sovereign citizen garbage. Here's the funny thing about it. while Massachusetts has very strict gun laws, it's actually not that hard to transport guns through the state of Massachusetts to Maine. All you have to do, which is, I believe, common. I'm not a gun owner. I don't follow this, but I did research this for this case. But as I understand it, in order to legally transport guns through Massachusetts, they have to be registered according to the laws of the state that you live in. They have to be stored unloaded in a locked case, and your ammunition has to be stored in a separate locked case. Period. End of story. Not a big deal. So if these guys had applied any degree of common sense, they would have done exactly that. And they would be up doing their training stuff in Maine, and nobody would have known, nobody would have cared. And also, for some reason, they decided that they didn't want to go to gas stations, so they carried their own fuel with them, and they were decanting it from gas cans into their cars, stupidly by the side of the road instead of pulling into a Walmart parking lot or something at 3 a.m.
Right.
So but they were just sitting there by the side of the road where, you know, as it happened, the cops saw them. So it's bizarre, the judgment, the chain of reasoning that would get you to think that being all tacked up in Massachusetts, you know, brandishing guns highly visibly by the side of the road, and, you know, filling up your gas, you know, for a made up task, right? Filling up your gas because you can't like pull into gas station. Instead of just like go to the gas station, keep your guns put away until you get to where you're going. You know,
but see, they're not subject to any of those laws, John, because of the Barbary Coast pirates, right?
Right. But it's like somewhere in the back of your mind, you got to think, you know, okay, licenses and fake license plates and no insurance. That's one level of criminal behavior. And yeah, it's going to get your car towed, and, you know, yeah, it'll probably be impounded, and it's going to be expensive because you're going to have to get insurance, and you're going to have to fix a lot of stuff, and it's going to be a few grand, which maybe you can or can't afford. But, you know, if you've got the money to buy all of this weaponry and, you know, all that, you have to have in the back of your mind that even if you passionately believe all this sob-sit nonsense, you know, that like something's got to go in the back of your mind saying, what if this heads sideways and I run into the cops? You know, some part of you knows that you're cosplaying and that this is a bad idea.
You would think that's true. You would think that's true, because you and I would certainly have those second questions, doubts. I tell you, man, I don't know that that's true with some of these guys. And when we talk about extremist beliefs, you know, we use the word extremist for a reason.
Yeah. And so, you know, I think the you know, what's interesting here, the obvious point here is that, you know, this is an example of, you know, a fairly standard set of sovereign beliefs turning into a potentially extremely violent group with a potentially extremely violence, getting itself into potentially extremely violent situations.
Yep.
And, you know, it could have been an absolute unbelievable disaster if somebody had started, you know, shooting, whether it was the cops who shot first or these guys that shot first. This could have turned into an absolute horrendous tragedy. You know, just
well, especially if that line was true about go take up a sniper position.
Yeah, and it's like, you know, that they're intending to do military shit to defend themselves, and you know, that's a truly scary thing. And I think, you know, you have to look at this. Really, the key message of these guys is that the line, you know, and this is active violence. This is not the sort of banal threats of violence that the Queen of Canada's followers in issuing these cease and desist letters. These are people who actually have got hands on guns.
Yep.
You know, the little old ladies that are going to hair salons and threatening them with arrest for masking, you know, that's threatening violence, but they're not armed.
It's almost a laughable joke from a little old lady.
It is, but it's still scary that she would, you know, somebody who would not normally think of, you know, life in prison for, you know, not wearing, you know, for wearing a mask would do that. But these guys are, you know, they were this close to, you know, starting Armageddon.
Yeah. Very much so.
And I think this is really, you know, the important thing is that the line between, you know, just being a bunch of anti-government whack jobs and being a massive terrorist threat is not that big.
No, it's not. It's really a matter of tweaking the belief a little bit, revving up the paranoia a little bit, and throwing some guns into the mix.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
It's like there is not a big chasm that you have to cross to get from sanity and civilization to insanity and anarchy. You know, it's a relatively smooth continuum, and that line is shifting. And I think I think that's a very, very important lesson to take away from these guys. And it's very fortunate for their sake and the sake of a lot of innocent people that didn't turn into a major conflagration. And it wouldn't have taken much to turn that into a massive shootout.
Yeah, exactly. I think your point is well taken, and I do want to highlight it. I do actually want to reinforce it. You know, there's a lot of laughing at, ridiculing, finger pointing at odd beliefs, bizarre groups, you know, strange ideas, ha, TT. But that danger factor is there with every single one of them. And I'm not saying that every single group is a Heaven's Gate, you know, prototype, but I'm saying that the possibility of going there, once you start going down that spectrum of extremism, there aren't breaks. You know, there's no stopping you necessarily, unless the cult leader has some moral foundation or, you know, principle of nonviolence, you know, and that tends to be, for example, even though bizarrely, you know, Hubbard and Miscavige are the most violent people in Scientology, they don't really go in that direction because the dogma and the belief set is very pacifistic. But you get a militia group together in tat gear with weapons, there's a hairbreadth away from disaster and tragedy.
Exactly.
It really needs to be highlighted. You know, these are dangerous groups. We don't call them destructive cults for no reason.
Yeah, and it's, you know, the thing is that as these groups evolve quickly, you know, you don't know who's coming in. There are some people, you know, there's going to be some percentage of people that are just unhinged. Remember, we just said that 0.5% or 1.6 to 1.7 million people are schizophrenic. So if you're a cult leader, 1 in 200, probably higher because it attracts such people, 1 in 200 of the people that show up in person are, you know, potentially mentally ill. Now, I do not mean to say that all schizophrenics are dangerous.
No, of course not.
You know, because many of them are properly medicated and able to live decent lives.
That's right.
But, you know, whether it's schizophrenia or other mental illness or just sociopathic tendencies, not organic brain issues, you know, that you know, there's a predilection towards, you know,
that's right,
people that are a little bit marginal.
Well, when you add on top of that marginalized rationality or ability to cognitively think through things or deal well with emotional ups and downs, however it manifests, when you add on top of that, see, that kind of thing, not easily managed, but people have managed it with medications, with therapy, etc. But you add on top of that the layers of culty nonsense that goes on, you're asking for trouble.
Yeah, and you know, so you just, you know, this is, you know, it's there's phrases stochastic terrorism, you know, that you know, if you just put out these messages enough, eventually, you know, even though you don't directly order that particular individual to pick up a gun, you just put out messages that says we have to fight to take our country back, or we have to fight for our belief system or whatever. Eventually, somebody is going to do it if you get enough followers. It's just the math, and so you know, that's a real problem.
And if you rationalize this sort of thing, I mean, let's take a look, for example, quickly at Comet Ping Pong Pizza Parlor, DC. One of those QAnon guys went marching in there, armed to the teeth, ready to free those kids. So you put a good spin on a bunch of lies as to why you need to be armed up, why you need to go engage in violence. People will do it.
Yeah,
people will do it just like that. It's not even like this is no rocket science. You know, this is what propaganda and cult indoctrination is all about.
Yeah. So exactly. So you know, so let's sort of start heading for home here, and let's start to look across all of what we've talked about so far, and let's start to pull together some, you know, some key threads of what's going on. And so, you know, we started off talking about how the internet is really enabling a different kind of group.
Yeah.
And so these aren't businesses the way that older cults, you know,
that's right.
The way that older cults have been. And The fact that they're not businesses means that their lifespan is likely to be fairly limited. That doesn't mean they will cause less harm, because I think that, it's a quick money grab by reflex. It's not a plan that these cult leaders have. And so the result is they're going to grab as much cash as they can, and they're, going to implode. They may not end up with a lot of money by the time all is said and done, because they're not doing accounting. They're not thinking strategically about investing that money to get the best return. They're not thinking like business people, but they're getting this money thrown at them by these followers. And, they're spending it on, in the case of Crossman, hotels for everybody as he transports them around to all these Trump rallies. Or in the case of Queen Romana, they're paying for her RV and her tour of her dominion, et cetera. So these are not businesses,
we could almost call them cults of opportunity.
That's a great term. I like that a lot. That's really, exactly. That all of a sudden you get these followers and you realize they'll do what you say. And now that we're able to start meeting in person, that you can have these followers that are going to give you money, and you're going to lead them in real life. And so, there's some money there. And so, but what happens in order to keep your followers is that you have to keep adding doctrine. And so it really inverts the paradigm of, if you look at any of the old groups, they had doctrine first, and then that was the product that they sold to followers, a very conventional model, like a business. Here you get these followers, and all of a sudden you realize that they really follow you, and now you got to have some doctrine. And so maybe you had one shtick, like Protzman with the numerology, or Queen of Canada with the COVID, and as that shtick wears out, to keep the momentum going, you have to add more stuff, and you're in a mad scramble to come up with doctrine and to just grab it from as many places as possible. Just grab as much stuff in as you can to differentiate yourself from the other, differentiate yourself from the People's Front of Judea. And, and so there's it's a real inversion of the paradigm. And as I say, these people are going to, there's going to be an initial flood of money as they sort of come to prominence, but as they fade, other groups come to more prominence. They'll start running out of money. They'll start getting more strident because the money's drying up. The game's going to be over.
That's right. That's right.
And so I think that's when they become dangerous.
That's right. I'll connect this a little bit, this cult of opportunity concept to the origins of Scientology. Different from Dianetics, which is exactly the business model you suggested, the product and then people follow. But it all fell apart. And Hubbard, in desperation, pulled out Scientology and spirituality. And through drugs and various other things, got people having wild experiences, coming up with dogma on the fly, coming up with the whole spiritual background of Thetans and the whole track and the crazy, the clam, all that stuff. I mean, most of that came out of drug-fueled fantasies, which was Hubbard desperately creating on that in order to preserve this follower thing and the money, keep the money coming in, and it really did evolve that way. The talent Hubbard had was that he could write really fast. And he could bring in ideas and conglomerate them quickly and put it out as though he had just had this discovery or epiphany or research model, which never existed. There was never any research. That wasn't what it was about at all. But he put out a false front that there was, and people bought into it, and the history kind of wrote itself. And so we do see some of that even in Scientology's history, and it was followed very quickly with people who came on board, namely Hubbard's wife, Mary Sue, his third and final wife, and some other people who did have some organizational sense. And after tanking Dianetics twice, for whatever reason, Hubbard had a good enough sense to let them take care of organizational stuff enough that it actually organized itself into a movement.
Yeah. I would almost argue, since I'm very familiar with the software industry, I would almost argue that Scientology follows the evolution of software companies. So I would say that in some respects, Dianetics was a first stab at the market, but it was not what they call these days minimum viable product. So it didn't have enough value to support an organization. There were all these informal Dianetics groups, but it wasn't enough for him to get paid. And
fair enough. The additional layer being Hubbard kept taking the money, so it never was allowed to become viable too.
Sure, that's fair.
Yeah.
But from a product, thinking in terms of a product, you say, okay, so he got singed pretty badly on that. And so I think what he realized is that if you had material that would bring people in for in-person something, that essentially the book became a commercial for another thing rather than the book being sufficient by itself.
Yep.
And that was the version 2.0 is where he got to a real minimum viable product instead of, and so, we talk about in investing in software companies, is this company a feature of a larger product? Is it a product, or is it really a company that has aftermarket sales, service support, and a whole bunch of things to really keep the customer attracted? And that was a big thing in the internet bubble when I got started in the capitalism business, that you had all these companies coming public, but the product really wasn't a product. It was really destined to be a feature that was incorporated into a larger product. And so there was a lot of this that you had to wrestle with. And so, I've spent a lot of time thinking about, does this company have a real minimum viable product? And sometimes I've been spectacularly wrong. So, there's been some pain along the way to understanding that. But these guys, this new generation, doesn't really think about that because they just have to get something to talk about when they interact with their followers every day, and to keep the money coming in.
And I'll say QAnon origins are exactly that too.
Yeah, and now it was like people just, and that's why you're splintering, because there wasn't any money to be made in the original, just wanking on social media about analyzing this just gibberish. And so you had to take QAnon, which gave you an audience, and then you had to add your own stuff to it to really start to make some money.
That's right. And I don't think on that line of logic that it's any accident that Prosman was a QAnon influencer. He was one of those breadcrumb guys who it's like interpreter and let's go. And that's how they monetize that model.
Right. Is to splinter off.
Yeah.
Because, you're a commodity if you're just an influencer, if you've got an audience, but the only way to monetize it is to have your own thing, because then you can control your followers. Otherwise, your followers are fungible. If you're selling the same belief set as somebody else, they can, it's like, it's a commodity.
That's right.
It's like going, McDonald's sells the same product everywhere in the U.S. So you walk in and a quarter pounder in Dubuque is the same as a quarter pounder in Manhattan.
That's right.
And, and that's a commodity. I mean, essentially within McDonald's, it doesn't matter where you buy it. And so you have to differentiate yourself.
That's right. And Prosman, for example, the -48 guy, he differentiated himself by starting to talk about JFK and Trump and JFK Jr. and the Dallas thing. And that's how he became his own thing. Yeah. Right.
Exactly. And so, differentiation is really important, and you have to keep piling the doctrine on, or you're going to lose your followers even faster than normal, brief lifespan of these groups.
That's right.
The other thing, I think that there's a major trend here that certainly, the rise of the Moors really isn't an example of this, but is incorporation of New Age stuff to broaden the appeal and really depoliticize it, because politically you're so polarized. There are so many Trump-related or pro-Trump or right-wing groups that market's tapped out, and you're never going to get a Biden fan to join your pro-Trump group.
That's
and
right.
So, at some point you're going to start running up against, that limits the addressable market. So the New Age stuff, and I don't think people are consciously making this decision the way that I would as somebody who thinks about corporate strategy a lot. They're just intuitively knowing that, the Trump election stolen anger is dissipating, because it's pretty hard to think, especially if you're thinking that Trump's going to run again, it's pretty hard to think that Trump's still the president.
Right.
And so you've got to get out of that. And I think that's happening. This is, and I think this is more, magical thinking, when you start to get into the New Age stuff, than it is about trying to find these little random data points that, have been shown to be ludicrous about, Chinese bamboo fibers in the paper ballots in Arizona, or whatever the nonsense is that people have been pushing. By the way, I don't know if you noticed that the last day or two, the Secretary of State in Arizona said there was one ballot that was invalid, a dead person who voted out of, the initial assertion of hundreds of thousands of dead people who voted. After 2 years, they finally found one person in the entire state of Arizona that somebody voted for them.
It's worth noting or mentioning, I suppose, because it's frustrating for people like us that, it takes 10 seconds to say anything you want, make any goddamn stupid ass claim you want. And it takes 10 months to 2 years to disprove it.
Yeah.
It's frustrating. It's teeth gnashingly frustrating to see this. And we see this with the Sandy Hook case. It's taken years for Alex Jones to finally see for these families to finally see some justice against this lying scumbag, and same here with the Arizona ballots. It's like all these people can say whatever they want. Well, it takes months to investigate, dig into all the details and prove. And then you do all that work and none of those people care because that's not why they believe it. They believe it because they have to believe it.
Yeah.
So it's very frustrating.
Yeah. So, I think that, okay. So I'm sorry, I just lost the segue here, but I think, the other thing, another question to think about is that, you have this group, doctrine that's evolving very quickly. The groups themselves are evolving, fragmenting, splintering, it's all a big soup. So one interesting question is, are these groups going to take away from groups like Scientology, or is this a parallel universe? And, in thinking about it, the initial reaction, given that there's some evidence that some of these groups, particularly QAnon, are actually taking away from evangelical church attendance, there's some potential, tendency to say yes. And the answer is, I think not. I think that there's still going to be an appeal for this structured, corporate, tangible real estate presence in-person group.
Yeah.
That there's going to be some category, and I don't think I could say now, right now, without doing some, thinking about this or research on this. I don't think I could say, well, what are the distinguishing characteristics? Somebody would go for an old school group versus what would be going for a new group. But I think it's, I don't see that I certainly don't see the rise of the Moors poaching people out of Scientology, because Scientology is pretty white and the rise of the Moors aren't. I don't actually see them poaching people out of the Nation of Islam, which might be a little bit more relevant example.
True.
Those groups have had typically very, the older groups now have very long time, very committed members.
That's
and
right.
Maybe are not expanding, membership. So I don't think they're going to, people are not going to sit there and go, gosh, auditing doesn't work for me. I think I'm now going to try Protzmann's numerology because I believe that JFK reincarnated. So these are very separate worlds. So I don't think that that's something that we need to see. But I think the other question, and I think, we actually sort of managed to talk about a lot of the concluding and the common points in the discussions of the individual groups. But I think one other interesting discussion is to say, how do these groups end? And is that different now? And, we talked when we did the Scientology thing a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the fact that it's pretty hard to kill a group like Scientology. And, I think what's interesting, and is perhaps a reason for hope, is that we can actually kill groups like some of these guys perhaps a little faster than we have in the past. And you made the point earlier that, these guys are not churches and therefore, are not going to be treated with kid gloves.
That's right.
The biggest thing, and when we talked about the Chase wave, debanking these guys, I think, is a very fast way to go to the jugular.
Yep.
And, there are all kinds of provisions. I think, to back up for a second, and we commented on this, maybe not in a couple of weeks ago, but we talked, I think, with the sovereign citizen, or we talked about, in one of the podcasts, we talked about the Patriot Act, which was passed very shortly after 9/11. And it essentially began the process of wiping out bank secrecy and of highly regulating any sort of money transfer business.
Yep.
So Venmo looks like a casual money transfer business, but it's actually quite highly regulated. Funds are very traceable, and there are all kinds of anti-fraud laws that apply to your ability to use Venmo. So if the government wants to shut down Protzman or Queen Romana or whatever, and I don't know how this works in Canada, it works likely fairly similar, but I don't know the authorities' willingness to pull this trigger. I think the U.S. is far more willing to pull this trigger than others. We have the most practice at this, but if you debank Protzman because the money is falling into his checking account, and then follow up with a fraud investigation, that he's been stealing people's money or that this is hot money, or try to exercise a clawback provision from somebody who is, now, like these people who are donating huge amounts of the family assets to him, you start, lawsuits that are trying to claw some of that back. The payment networks are going to shut them down even before the courts criminally are going to shut them down.
That's
and
right.
So when they stop having the access to this money that's flowing in, these things are going to go under fairly quickly.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that people are suddenly going to wake up and say, oh, I guess I was wrong. This Protzman guy, now that he's not paying my hotel for me to follow him around, grovel at his feet and go to Trump rallies any longer, maybe he was wrong about everything, and I'm all better now, and I'm going to try to go back and make amends to my family. No, not going to happen. So you're still going to have followers that are a real mess when their guru gets rolled up.
Yep.
But in terms of, their vulnerability, they don't have an infrastructure. They don't have a legal department. They don't have an OSA dirty tricks squad. They don't have private investigators hassling enemies.
That's right.
They don't have any of the infrastructure that the established type of group has had for a long time and knows how to wield. And
right.
so,
and frankly, the people running these outfits are just not savvy enough or informed enough to be able to think their way through that kind of organizational structure.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Queen Romana, I think, because I believe she's clinically mentally ill, the Queen of Canada is just not going to be capable of doing anything other than taking Venmo or GoFundMe, or I think she's been deplatformed from GoFundMe and some others. She's just putting money into a personal checking account, or, a trusted follower is collecting the money. And there's really very little other than what's the cash balance today that's guiding the financial decisions.
Yeah.
So if you attack them, if you go for the jugular and debank them so that followers can't move money to her or to any of them, it falls apart fairly quickly.
Yeah.
With the rise of the Moors, it's a little more difficult. But, the FBI has shown a reasonable ability to infiltrate a number of these militia groups. It takes them a while, but, like the Oath Keepers, seems to, the leadership seems to be getting decapitated in the wake of the January 6th, assault on the Capitol.
Yeah.
And so this was a fairly sophisticated militia group, and the feds managed to, have some fairly high-level leaders that turned out to be collaborators and informants. So they have been reasonably capable at rolling these folks up. The smaller militias may not be as high on the radar scope, and they still have the potential for violence. So while the rise of the Moors were probably known to the Providence police, they weren't necessarily known to the Massachusetts police. But I think that there's going to be emphasis on catching these groups when they're still, fairly small.
Yeah, exactly. Well, like we saw here in Colorado, one or two instances of police run-ins, and it's not necessarily noted. Couple more, though, pretty soon the entire state knows about these people,
Yes.
and they're on the lookout for them. And then the justice system, the judges, especially when they were attacking judges directly, that layer finds out about it. And at that point, they're getting short shrift no matter where they go.
Well, I think there's a lot more, especially in the wake of 9/11 and the Patriot Act, there's a lot more national and local cooperation. So the fact that case files will be able to go national, so that, you know, if you have the rise of the Moors in Providence that are, you know, flagged as a suspicious and potentially dangerous group, and then they all decide that they're going to move to Alabama, the Alabama police are going to, you know, be able to tap in, and, you know, they run the prints on these guys. There'll be, you know, there's a lot more, you know, national clearinghouse level stuff going on.
Right.
So even, you know, even some of these smaller militia groups, I think, are going to get more up on the radar screen, and they'll get tamped down a little faster. And you know, I think that there's some, you know, I think that the ability of the government to quickly and efficiently take out the leadership of a group that starts to become a real danger, I think, is quite high. The problem is that of scale. And while these guys leave lots of footprints on instant messaging that are, you know, have great evidentiary value, right? Like all these sovereign citizens, as we pointed out, who videotape their own traffic stops, you know, which turn out to be great evidence used against them. You know, or all the January 6th people who are like, hey, I'm standing on Nancy Pelosi. You know, I just peed on Nancy Pelosi's desk. Damn, we're, you know, taking the Capitol back. And then they post it on Facebook, right? That, you know, but it's just, it becomes a problem of scale,
right?
That to win a conviction in, you know, federal court for, you know, for some, you know, for a federal crime, it's not trivial. They really prepare for trials, and you know, this can, you know, it's a scale problem. Even though the government has the money, they don't necessarily have enough trained people to go after and shut down all of these groups that are emerging.
Right. Exactly. How interesting.
Yeah, it's a very different world than the world of, you know, Scientology, which is a large and entrenched fixed target.
Yep.
These are, you know, essentially like, you know, roving motorcycle gangs that pop up in random locations, wreak havoc, and then move on.
That's right. Yeah, because one of the factors with Scientology, of course, and a lot of these other more permanent groups, is the real estate holdings. You know, I mean, they got property all over the place. These guys don't. You know, NXIVM didn't.
Yeah, well, you know, Queen Romana at this point is probably homeless. She's probably living in that RV and is out of her former residence in Victoria, BC. It's certainly the case that, you know, Prossman is homeless, and in researching for this thing, you know, he was thrown out of the house by his wife. The house was either sold or foreclosed or something. So I don't think he necessarily has a home to go back to. And so, you know, there was an attempt at the replicating the Canadian truckers convoy in the U.S. Earlier this year, and that really fizzled pretty ridiculously with a lot more. You know, they raised. Interestingly, Lee Dundas, a Scientologist attorney, was one of the early organizers of that, and she managed to raise like $1.6 million or $1.8 million. And nobody seems to quite know what happened to it, and she's been lying low for a while. So it's not clear that all that money got channeled to the truckers and the, you know, to pay for fuel and whatnot. But that group quickly devolved. You know, by the time they reached Washington, and then it finally fell apart. But there are still a couple of dozen diehards that are occupying a small slice of land on the National Mall, protesting. They can't really tell you what they're protesting. They're sort of just protesting, and they're, you know, trying to, quote, restore the Republic of 1776 and impose morality while they're busy being homeless, breaking lots of small ordinances, committing adultery, threatening people, and not being exactly moral. You know, and they're all homeless basically at this point. And the only thing that keeps them from living in, you know, in a van down by the river is the donations that are flowing in.
Right. Wow.
You know, so it's a pretty shitty life being one of these, you know, these cult followers, I think, at this point.
Yeah. Well, I again, not big on predictions, not trying to be, but I will say that, you know, when desperate times bring out desperate people, and if people perceive these times as desperate, well, I think there's some truth to that. But people can take it too far. People can obviously go beyond. And once they start not trusting the social system that they live in and putting their faith and their work and their energy into maintaining and keeping those social structures so we're all kind of on the same page. Once they give up on that and decide the whole thing needs to be torn down, then they start taking on, they start doing crazy stuff. And I think it's fairly predictable that we're going to see more of that rather than less in the immediate future.
Absolutely. It's, for so many reasons, the next 5 years are going to be, I think, one of the toughest periods in our lives.
Yeah.
What's driving the inflation, and, this is sort of veering off topic.
Sure.
But, what's driving inflation is fundamentally a withdrawal or a collapse of the globalization that's been in place since the end of World War II. And basically, the United States became the guarantor of free trade globally for everybody, as long as you opposed the Soviet Union. And so we bought, I think one way to think of it is we by putting our money behind everybody's free trade, we benefited massively from it. And the economic expansion over the last 75 years has been unprecedented in history for us and for everybody else. The rise of China was very much enabled by this. But with the end of the Cold War, and now particularly with the revelation that the Russian military is a bad joke, given what's going on in Ukraine, and with the likelihood that that's not just, a temporary lull of training, but a systemic rot that makes the Russians, other than their nuclear weapons, completely irrelevant in the world stage, there's no need to have that system. And we've been, essentially reducing it. So there's going to be a lot of changes to trade dynamics. And while, some of the sources that I've been looking at are suggesting the U.S. is, North America, actually, not just the U.S., but Mexico and Canada, as an integrated trade bloc, is very well positioned to weather the future. We have stable or growing population. And if we accelerate immigration and make our country welcoming to immigrants once again, we will continue to attract and have population growth. Most places other than Africa are seeing population drops, which is also going to be very bad for the economy, and it's going to cause some wars. So one of the reasons potentially that Putin has gone into Ukraine is the Russian population is collapsing. The under 30 demographic is really dramatically below the number of people that are aging out. Life expectancy continues to drop for a whole variety of reasons. Russia is going to be half of what it was in another 40 years. So he's not going to have enough of an army to be a factory. He's not going to have enough skilled workers to prop up even the natural resource economy that he has. So Russia's in trouble. China is actually also going to see a dramatic population drop. Some experts now think it's going to drop by half in 40 years. That's way ahead of the predictions of even a decade ago. The previous estimate was it was going to drop by half by 2100. So in 80 years, now it's going to drop by half. People are just not having kids, and it's at this point relatively irreversible. So that's going to be, again, a major geopolitical catalyst. Some countries in Asia are going to do okay. Vietnam, I think. You're going to see India has some choices to make, but I think their population is still somewhat stable. And I think they have, pretty good choices. There's Australia, Argentina, several others. Japan's going to do well. Japan's actually going to be more activist militarily in Asia, continue to partner with the U.S. To contain China. But all of this is massive realignment from the way the world has worked for the last 80 years.
Yeah.
And a lot of this stuff is going to happen very quickly. You're going to see a lot of changes in oil distribution. So likely gas prices and oil prices will remain high. You'll see some challenges in technology. Moving semiconductor production back to the U.S. is going to be absolutely a screamingly important priority. I was glad to see that legislation to support that was passed, to my surprise, quite easily.
That's good.
But there's some massive realignments. People are going to be moving business out of China aggressively, more so than before COVID. which is going to exacerbate the economic situation in China. It's going to get ugly out there.
Yeah.
And, while we are ultimately going to be okay, it's going to be very scary. And then you add climate change on top of this, we were talking about earlier. We are going to have, and not in a good way, the most memorable 5 years of our lives.
Wow.
And it's ultimately going to be okay, but it's going to be really tough getting there. There will be a new equilibrium, and I think we're going to be okay.
Okay.
But it's just going to be tough. And so that's really fertile breeding ground. It's really fertile breeding ground for a lot of these groups, and especially among the aged, right? That people that are 60 and up, especially less educated, the risks to Social Security from people, not the system going bankrupt, but people just saying, we're tired of doing this, no more Medicare, no more Social Security. That's a big, that's been, I think, popping up in the news again. Lately, it's been quiet for a while. Literally starving our senior citizens. So, that's going to be a very the stereotype of the recruiting table on a college campus pulling people into cults. Nope, it's going to be little old ladies on social media that are scared about their Social Security. It's so I think it's going to be very stressful.
It's as we were all saying at the beginning of COVID, it was becoming more and more real to some of us. May you live in interesting times.
Yes, indeed.
Well, these are some of the most interesting, I suppose.
Yeah, no, it's been unusually calm for the last 30 years, I think. And the last 40, certainly the last 40, but it's been unusually calm, and and so we need to really be on guard. We need to stop this polarity and isolation and everybody first. We can meet these challenges, but we're going to have to, as the voice of reason and calm and taking the long view and of science and intellect, there's a lot of work ahead of us for people like us.
Exactly. And on that note, thank you, John. Thank you very much for that breakdown, because this is not doom and gloom, and that's not where we're trying to go with this messaging at all. It's the fact of a proper assessment of the situation is required if we're going to navigate it successfully.
Yeah. And, I think to come back to a message of hope, and this is something we talked about, I think in the last podcast, is that, after World War I, particularly, World War II was horrific in the damage wrought. The number of people died, the tens of millions of people in Russia alone, and plus, genocide of the Jews and all of the other war casualties. It was horrific, but it was like, here we go again. But World War I was unprecedented 100 years ago.
Right.
And the scale of slaughter, destruction, the sheer stupidity of how it got started, all of that, from a continent that was legendary for wars, right? I was reading something in preparation for this tonight about the various Napoleonic wars, and just the sheer viciousness of just constantly war after war after war. And relatively in Napoleon's short reign, he was at war all the time.
Yep.
Against everybody.
Yeah.
And, the number of just the damage and destruction. But World War I was really singular in terms of technology being employed at the level that it was for the first time. Yep. And, you understand why the Jehovah's Witnesses went out big saying 1918 is the end of the world.
Yep.
Because it sure looked like it.
That's right.
And yet, if you look at what's happened to the world in terms of life expectancy, quality of life, economic activity, any conceivable measure, the world today, as challenged as we are today, with all of the things that are going on, climate change and everything else, we're in so much better shape. It's inconceivable how much better life is. There's really nobody alive today from 1918 who was an adult then, essentially, who can provide direct testimony, but we can figure out pretty well that life is still pretty damn good today. And we rebounded in reasonably short period of time from World War I, especially outside of Germany. You know, they were still kind of reeling, which is why we had World War II.
And the UK, which was hit so hard.
Yeah. And so, but still the rebound, both after World War I and World War II, you know, we now know that the best days of humanity lay ahead of this absolutely apocalyptic wasteland that we saw in Europe at the end of World War I. And so, you know, I think that, you know, we're obviously living in the present, and this is what we know. And, you know, that's an intellectual exercise to look at World War I. But now, you know, we look at this, and it's absolutely, as I said before, I'm pretty calm about such things, and I'm stressed by all of the stuff I'm doing at work.
Right.
You know, that I shared a little bit of just now. Right. And that's not usual for me. It's eating away at me all the time. And you know, I can take some comfort when I can stop long enough and remind myself of the World War I analogy, but it's still not enough. It's still, you know, then something else happens, and then I'm like, shit, what else?
I know, because predictions are a dime a dozen, and all we can do is the best we can do with the data. But we know that historically the cycles are, you know, quality of life, health, longevity, all of it, they are rising statistics. And even in the face of all the disastrous whatever that we're facing right now, our man-made climate change, I think, top of the list.
Yep.
You know, we've got real problems and challenges ahead of us. They're real, and they're in our face right now. Yep. And you know, and just to kind of conclude this, I suppose, you know, is I am an optimist, and I am going to continue to be that is what I need to be. And I'm going, and I think your World War I comparative is useful, because it's not, you know, it wouldn't necessarily be really comforting to somebody who lived in 1905, right? To know this disaster is looming, right? But that there is a brighter side maybe on the other end of it after, you know, the disaster. Maybe that's the situation we're in now, where we know we've got tough times ahead, but, you know, very few people are really talking about, well, what about that? And what happens after that? I mean, because the fact of the matter is we're barely preparing for what's coming. So there's a lot of work ahead of us still. And I think you're absolutely right in that. From my perspective, what I want to end this show on is I want to say to my audience who is here for, you know, the culty sociological psychology end of this, at least that's my perspective on this stuff, is I want you guys to keep your, you know, go into this future knowing things are tough, but keep your eyes open and keep those frontal lobes engaged, because there are going to be cults of opportunity popping up and cults of personality popping up all over the place during times of stress and conflict. That's what happens.
Yep. And keep your eyes open for you and to inoculate those you love.
That's right.
And the earlier you see it, and the earlier you can inoculate them, the safer they're going to be.
That's right.
And, you know, I think, you know, this cultic stuff does go in phases. You know, if we go back to the 70s, you know, people do, for the most part, eventually come to their senses.
Yep.
In the 70s, we thought leisure suits, platform shoes, and disco was were good ideas.
Right.
And, you know, fortunately, we did come to our senses. You know, those people who have kept leisure suits in their closets for 50 years, just in case they come back, have been disappointed.
That's
and I think humanity is better off for that.
Yep, exactly.
And so, you know, people, as I say, sanity for most people will eventually return. Unfortunately, it's a question of how much damage, you know, that
can be done in the meantime.
You know, leisure suits are only reputational damage, fortunately.
That's right. Well, John, again, thank you very much for your time and consideration on all of this and the work that you did researching it. I really appreciate it. And it was, I think we've really done a bit of a show here. I think this is pretty good.
Well, thanks. I realize it's probably gone on for this may be a record for one of your shows, but you know, I don't even know what time it is, but you know, I absolutely, one of my favorite things to do when I do podcasts is to do them with you. So because we always tend to play off each other fairly well. So you know, if you come up with any ideas, or if the commenters down below come up with any ideas that you know, people know me enough to know kind of how I think of things, And if there's an idea for something related to cults or non-reality or whatever it is that's within your wheelhouse that you think I could take a look at from my perspective, please put it in the comments. I'll continue to read the comments, and Chris will, and we'll see if we can come up with something else fun to talk about.
You bet. Absolutely. All right, folks. So you heard him. Put it in the comments if you got feedback, if you have things to say about this, good, bad, or sideways. I'm very interested in what you all think about what we talked about today. So on that happy note, I will also say, please do support the show, because, you guys are the ones keeping me on air. You guys are the ones who are absolutely keeping me in a job. So I will encourage you to please continue doing so via Patreon, PayPal, Venmo, whatever. All the links are in the show notes or the description section below here. So thank you very much for coming around and listening to us gabber on, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for being generous with your time. Thank you.